Thank you again, everyone, for joining today. My name is Dan Tanding. I'm the Director of Research with the Institute for Catastrophic Loss Reduction. I'm hosting today with my colleagues Eric Sparling from the Climate Risk Institute and Katarina Lotson from GIZ. Together with the Ontario First Nations Technical Services Corporation, our organizations make up the PIEVC Program Alliance. Claire Sanders from the Climate Risk Institute is today's Zoom host and is available for technical questions. So if you have any trouble with the webinar platform, please find Claire's name in the chat function and send her a note directly. Also a note for attendees today, we'll be using polls. The polls will come onto your screen periodically throughout the webinar. If you wouldn't mind taking the time to respond to the polls, that would be very appreciated. Note also that we're recording the webinar, as I mentioned. We'll send a link to anyone who registered. We had over 350 registrants. Anybody who was not able to attend will be able to access a recording of the webinar via the CRI website, and Claire will be providing a link to all registrants after the event. We'd also like to especially welcome those who are joining from outside of Canada. As of last night, we had about 27 countries represented in our registrations. So it's really great to see such a great deal of interest around the world. And it's why I would say good morning to everyone and welcome, because certainly the times are different around the world. I'd also like to state that I'm extremely grateful to be able to join you from land that's situated within the traditional and treaty territory of the Mississauga, more specifically the Mississauga of Scugog Island First Nation, signatories of the Gunshot Treaty of 1788 and the Williams Treaty of 1923. I welcome everyone on the line today to introduce themselves by the chat function and include a land acknowledgement if appropriate. But please indicate if you are able to your name and where you're from, and we'll get a good sense of who's on the line today. So before we get started, Claire is going to bring up a few polls. We have about 80 people on the line currently. And we'll quickly run through these polls and get a sense of where people are joining from and the sector, their area of focus, and whether or not they're familiar with the PIEVC program, the Pvc Protocol. So first poll is, where are you joining from? So we'll give people a few seconds to respond.
All right, I'm going to end the poll, I think. We put that there. Wow, lots of great stuff in the chat too. Thanks, everyone. This is amazing. All right, share results.
Okay, great. A large group from Canada, obviously, and also from several other regions around the world. Great, thank you, Claire.
Let's see. Here we go. What sector best represents you? All right, and that poll.
Okay, great. A good mix from different levels of government, consulting organizations, Indigenous, non-government, and industry and other.
Okay, we've got two more. Sector of focus. Okay. Great. We've got at least one person electrical distribution or transmission, which is great because I swapped out that nice image on the on this slide just for you.
Good image to represent your industry.
Yeah.
And, okay, a really good mix of sectors represented. Claire, would these poll results also be included in the recording?
Oh, that's good. I don't think they are actually, but maybe I can actually send them out in the follow-up email because it's pretty interesting. It's neat to see. And last one. And sorry, again, the panelists can't vote, I'm afraid. So that's why we didn't see any coastal structures in. Great. Okay, I think we're good. And poll.
Okay, excellent. Good mix as well.
Okay.
Well, it's good to know I think for our panelists that there is about a third of attendees have not used the PIEVC protocol and are interested in learning more. So we're glad that this forum can serve that purpose, as well as informing those who are familiar with the protocol. Thanks, everyone. There's lots of introductions coming through the chat. Please, if you have a chance to fill out, to indicate where you're from, your organization, your sector in the chat box, that would be very good to see. So I think we'll switch to the next slide here, Claire. Okay. A quick note on today's webinar. So this is the second of 8 webinars that are leading up to an in-person global forum in April 2023. The purpose of the webinars, also I note that the webinars are part of an overall effort by the PIEVC program to increase engagement with the practitioners involved in buildings and infrastructure, climate change, vulnerability assessment, climate resilience in Canada internationally. The global forum, the webinars, and also an upcoming practitioners network are meant to better facilitate interaction between practitioners, help with sharing of information, and sort of build capacity for climate vulnerability assessment. We have a general schedule of webinar topics, but we welcome ideas and input from anybody participating in the webinar today, or any of your colleagues for suggestions on topics or presenters. Currently, we're on the second webinar, September 22nd. We have a number planned for the coming months before the Global Forum in April. These are the general topic areas that we would like to cover, but if there is a strong interest in any topic area coming from the stakeholder network, we'd very much like to hear from you. And as I said, if you have a project or a topic related to climate vulnerability assessment, climate resilience and infrastructure and buildings, and anything specifically related to application of the PIEVC protocol, we'd very much like to hear from you. So please let us know if you are interested, or if you have colleagues interested in presenting in front of this forum. We have a pretty good turnout. So today we got about 100 people. Last meeting we had about 150. So it's potentially a very good forum to get the word out about your work. And if you do have interest in submitting ideas for webinars, you can contact us, and I'll provide a link here in the chat box. There's a sort of a generic PIEVC program contact email. So feel free to contact us or any of the panelists here if you know us, with ideas for future webinars. So next slide, please, Claire. So a quick note on the previous webinar that we held in August. During the August webinar, we provided background on the PIEVC program, including an outline of the PIEVC program partners, the status of the objectives, the status and the objectives of the PIEVC program, and an overview of PIEVC program resources. This webinar was recorded and is available via the CRI website, and I think Claire can provide a link to this webinar. So in today's webinar, we will not be going through another review of the PIEVC program, the PIEVC Alliance members, that information is available. And if you have any trouble accessing that recording, please let us know. Okay, on to the next slide, please, Claire. So today's webinar is about implementing recommendations from after the undertaking of vulnerability and risk assessment. We'd also like to hear from you, the participants on the webinar today, about some of the challenges associated with implementation of recommendations that will help inform protocol updates and training in the future. There will be a post-webinar survey. In that survey, we've included a question on this topic, and we'd like all participants to consider the survey and provide any information that is available to them on implementation of findings from climate vulnerability assessments. Now, I'm going to, the format of the webinar today, I will briefly introduce each of the presenters. We'll hear from each of our presenters. We have 3 presentations lined up today. And then we'll have facilitated discussion after the presentations. So we will not be handling questions during the presentations, but please feel free to use the Q&A function to enter your questions at any time throughout the webinar. And we'll make sure that we get to as many questions as possible during the discussion period after the presentations. So first, our first presentation will be from Marvin Eagerbergson. Marvin is currently Manager of Engineering for the town of Grimsby in Ontario in Canada, within the region of Niagara. Marvin obtained his Bachelor of Science in Engineering from the University of Guelph, specializing in water resources engineering. Prior to joining the town of Grimsby in 2021, Marvin worked for the City of Welland for about 15 years. Prior to joining the City of Welland, Marvin spent 11 years in consulting, primarily concerning the design and construction of municipal drainage, capital, and private development projects. It's during his time at the City of Welland that Marvin was involved in the PIEVC vulnerability assessment, which focused on their water and wastewater infrastructure. And we'll certainly be hearing more about that today. After Marvin, we'll be hearing from Haran Sandanayake. Haran is a senior engineer of water resources in the City of Ottawa, in Ottawa, Canada. Ontario, Canada. Haran has degrees in both civil engineering and economics. Haran's role as a water resources engineer in the asset management branch in the City of Ottawa includes technical assessments, flood risk assessment, climate change adaptation, and integration of asset management into business practices, including planning and growth, asset management plans, flood control, and infrastructure renewal. Haran has recently overseen the first citywide flood risk profile, an invention by the City of Ottawa's water resource engineers, and Ottawa's first stormwater asset management plan. Haran is also chair of the Canadian Water and Wastewater Association's National Committee on Climate Change. Next, we'll have Nguyen Trong Nam, who is a researcher at the Southern Institute of Water Resources Planning, or SIWRP, in Vietnam. Nguyen graduated from Tu Loy University in Vietnam with a bachelor's degree in hydrology and environment. As a researcher in the SIWRP for 12 years, he has participated in a number of projects on water resources planning at various scales and in natural, and in natural disaster management in the water sector in the Mekong Delta. He is passionate about sustainable water management and hydrometeorological risk reduction studies, focusing on building resilience in hydraulic works, irrigation systems, and other infrastructures. Furthermore, he's also interested in hydroinformatics and believes that digital technology plays a crucial role in achieving sustainability of water management and in dealing with climate risks worldwide. And joining Nam is Ms. Vo Bang Na, who is currently working for the Department of Science, Education, Natural Resources, and Environment under the Ministry of Planning and Investment. Ms. Na's main focus is in sustainable development, green growth, and climate change. Coming from a background of chemistry, she's obtained a bachelor's degree in green chemistry and process engineering from the UK, and understands the importance of bridging the gap between practitioners and politicians and making policy be more practical and effective has become her personal goal, especially in her field of work. So we're very happy to have all of our presenters today and look forward to learning a great deal from their presentations. I'm going to turn it over now to Marvin. And as I mentioned before, we'll hear from all of our speakers and then we'll have a discussion after the presentations. And please feel free to use the Q&A function to answer questions throughout the presentations, and we'll hold all discussion until the end of the presentations. And with that, I'll pass it over to Marvin.
Great, thanks, Dan. And yeah, I wanted to thank everyone that joined today from, I guess, across the world. It's late for some and early for others. So thanks for being here. And I'm actually honored to be part of the group that's presenting today. And I really appreciate everyone's time. So next slide, please, Claire. Yeah, so my presentation today, I'm going to go over the study objectives and the purpose of the project I was involved in, acknowledgments and project partners, talk about the study area, a little bit about the PIEVC protocol that was used and the climate variables, talk a little bit about our IDF work that was associated with this project, our risk assessment portion, the action plan and recommendations that came out of the study, and then I want to finish off with a little bit of what we did after the study in terms of the follow-up work. So next slide, please. So the project, as I mentioned, was actually initiated. We were interested in updating our IDF curve, and it kind of ballooned or blossomed into a little bit more than that. We found out Engineers Canada at the time was assessing vulnerability issues and adaptation approaches across Canada for buildings, roads, stormwater, wastewater, and water resources. So at that time, Welland was fortunate to be chosen to do essentially a case study, PIEVC case study for the storm and wastewater system, and then add that to the national database. And really, I guess the underlying reason was we really wanted to, when we were replacing assets, to consider climate change. We didn't at the time really know what that meant, but that was really kind of the foundation of the project. Next slide, please. So just some acknowledgements to start off. We were fortunate to work with some very smart gentlemen from AMEC, which is now Wood Environmental. So shout out to Ron Scheckenberger, Peter Nimrichter, and Ben Harding. And then our project partners, to name a few: Environment Canada, the actual province of Ontario, and Engineers Canada, just to highlight a few of those project partners. Next slide, please. So just for everyone's kind of benefit, like where is Welland? So Welland's located in Ontario, Canada. It's about 1.5 hours from Toronto, within the Golden Horseshoe. Kind of uniquely located between two Great Lakes, Lake Erie to the south and Lake Ontario to the north. And it's one of 12 municipalities within the region of Niagara, with a population of just over 50,000 people. Next slide. I'd just like to include this slide. It's an aerial of the city, and it shows that the city is bisected by the Welland Canal, which is a really cool feature for the city and actually surrounding area itself, although it does pose associated challenges with servicing both water and wastewater, as you can appreciate. So I'd just like to throw that up there just for context. Next slide, please. So the PIEVC protocol, so we used it was a 2009 protocol that was used for this study. So I've got the flow chart up there, and essentially step one, which I'm sure most of the folks on the line have seen this many times. Step one, being the project definition. In our case, was the stormwater and wastewater infrastructure. The data gathering portion, we were fortunate to have a very solid GIS database, so that was good. The risk assessment portion, looking at loads and impacts for two future timeframes, 2020 and 2050. And then there's the analysis portion, and then into the conclusions and recommendations component. I do have the triple bottom line module shown on the screen. That was not used as part of our study, but I just wanted to put that up there just for demonstration purposes that it was available. Next slide, please. So we looked at a long list of climate variables, temperature, rain, snow, winds, and fog, to name a few, and then looked at what these climate changes might be into future timeframes, so 2020 and 2050. Next slide, please. So just to highlight a few of the general outcomes that we found from the study and looking at the climate variables changing. The number of days per year with temperature exceeding 35 degrees Celsius was to remain the same through 2020, but was expected to increase 4 times into 2050. The number of days per year with temperature below -20 was expected to decline through 2050. The days per year of freeze-thaw cycles to decline. Rainfall and severity of rain was expected to increase, and the occurrence of drought-dry periods was expected to double through 2020. The report and study was completed in 2012, so 8 years prior to that date. So, next slide, please. So I mentioned that there was this, I'll say, add-on feature. It was really the impetus for the project, but it turned into be, I guess, a component of the study. Was an assessment of the current city's IDF relationship. So there was 4 years of data that was available and reviewed and used for the study. 112 global climate models were run, and the output was used to predict the 2 future IDF curves for 2020 and 2050. One of the interesting outcomes that we found was the current IDF curve that was used was actually a 1963 curve based out of Buffalo, New York. And we found it actually to be quite conservative compared to the future 2020 and 2050 curves for the more frequent storm events. And we believe that was because of the location of Welland being a little bit more inland compared to Buffalo, which is at the eastern end of Lake Erie that does experience a little bit more extreme weather events. So that was our rationale for that. Really, at the end of the day, it left us with some questions. You know, which curve should be used? So obviously that sparked a little bit more investigation on our part. Next slide, please. So the risk assessment portion, I really found this one of the most interesting parts of the whole process was to create this matrix with climate parameters across the top and infrastructure components along the side. And then to sit down with a lot of or many subject matter experts and essentially just populate the matrix, assigning probability and severity scores, and then ultimately doing the risk calculation for all those scores and determining which which associated I guess component was one that we should be focusing our time and energy on. So next slide, please. So out of the study came 44 recommendations, and we grouped them into different categories. But essentially, we looked at short-term, medium term, and long-term recommendations, and we were initially then planning to focus, and we did, on 2 initial short-term recommendations, and those being essentially, should we be updating the IDF curve for the city? And number 2, should we be looking at increasing or revising the storm design standard for the city? So next slide, please. So this really then leads into the kind of follow-up to what did we do after the study? And I just wanted to share a few slides on what we've done, what we did after the study was completed. So next slide, please. So what we did is we took a look at a local residential subdivision, 25 lots, so a smaller development that was already built and serviced, and we looked at what would that subdivision servicing look like if we did design it again, considering climate change. So next slide, I will kind of go through a couple of the things that we found. So next slide, please. So on the major events, so we looked at the pond first, and with the pond being designed to a 100-year storm, we found that the current design using the 1963 curve was providing for some freeboard, approximately 5 inches. But looking, if it were to to be designed again using the future 2020 and 2050 IDF curves, allowing for climate change. In both scenarios, we found that the pond would actually overtop, which was an interesting finding. Next slide, please. And then for the minor storm sewer servicing, there again, what we found supported the initial analysis of the IDF, I guess, being conservative. So the 2-year event, you can see this is looking at the increase in cost with the different IDF scenarios. So the more frequent event, the 2-year event, you can see that it really didn't matter what IDF relationship we used. It was pretty much the same across the board. But as you go, you looking at more less frequent storms. If you go to the 25-year event, for example, you could see there's close to about a 20% increase in cost if we were to then incorporate the 2050 IDF curve. So there was an impact to obviously the servicing costs of a development. So we decided that this was great information, but it was important to do a little bit more, I guess, ground truthing before we actually made the jump to make some changes. So next slide, please. So what we decided to do was look at a little bit larger sample. We looked at a 20-hectare residential development that was, again, already built, serviced, but had experienced some recent flooding events directly related to the stormwater management pond. So yeah, one more click there, Claire, just to bring up the pond. So that's where the stormwater management pond was located. So it was built as part of the residential development. And then one more click, we'll see there's a kind of a dashed red line. And that is the, yeah, next click there, please. Yeah, so that's the another local development that was coming to be a component, I guess, of the residential subdivision. But what it would end up doing was essentially taking up all the, I guess, available surplus land adjacent to the stormwater pond. So next slide, please. So some of the findings from that study was that there would be an 18% increase in spill flow from the pond if you compare the 2020 IDF to the current, but a 15% increase in peak spill flow between the 2050 and 2020, and about a 35% increase in peak spill flow out of the pond if you compare the 2050 to the existing IDF. So fairly significant. So as you know, we went back, we said, well, what are we going to do about this? So we did a complete pond cleaning and had an overflow pipe installed so that it would essentially alleviate any future flooding within that development. Next slide, please. So yeah, I just wanted to finish off on kind of what we then decided to do with all of that information. So we had the PIEVC study. We took a couple of recommendations and we did some additional analysis and investigation with that. And so next slide, please, Claire. So then what essentially position that we were at was to do two things. One was to look at updating our municipal design standards. So essentially increasing the storm design from the current 2-year to the 5 or 10, in using the work that we had done to support those changes. And then additionally, the IDF curve, increasing or replacing the current 1963 curve with a future 2020 or 2050. And then the final piece of work that we were doing was essentially assessing the rest of the storm ponds within the city for climate change vulnerability. So we found that the one pond was certainly impacted by the larger storm events and the future storm events that were being predicted. How would the rest of the ponds in the city perform under the same kind of scenario? So that's essentially where we were at with this study. And next slide, please. I think that's essentially it, and hopefully I'm okay for time. Yeah, so that's it. So I wanted to say thank you again to everyone for hopping on the webinar, taking your time, and yeah, look forward to any questions at the end. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Marvin. And we're going to pass it right over to Haran Sandaniakin.
Thanks, Dan. Thanks, Marvin. I think, next slide, please. I think people will see that there are some similarities between what Marvin has been doing or trying to do in his jurisdiction and what we've been trying to do in Ottawa. I'm going to take a slightly different approach here and talk a little bit more about asset management, almost going towards one of Martin's last questions in his presentation about he was looking at one scenario, and now what about the bigger picture? But it was a bit of a journey for us to get there. Next slide, please. Just some quick context. Next slide, please. Dan already mentioned who I am, but just as a reminder, I'm a water resources engineer, but also working in asset management in the city of Ottawa in Canada. And next slide, please. And I just wanted to make sure that people understood the context that I'm speaking from. I know there's a lot of organizations represented here and many, many countries. And so some of the things that you see here may be applicable to you, others perhaps not. So just a quick recap or summary. Ottawa is Canada's capital with a population of approximately 1 million people. Our national capital region actually spans 2 cities in 2 separate provinces, the city of Gatineau in the province of Quebec and the city of Ottawa in the province of Ontario, from where I am right now. It's separated by the Ottawa River, and among other impacts, we both experience riverine and pluvial flooding. For those people not so familiar with Canada, Ottawa in particular has 4 distinct seasons, and our temperatures range from plus 33 degrees Celsius in the summer to minus 25 in the winter, though I'm sure some residents in Ottawa will claim that it gets much colder. That's the average anyways. Next slide, please. And I work for the Ottawa Municipal government. And so just a few things about what our responsibilities are. The image on the slide in the purple outline shows the boundaries of the municipality of the city of Ottawa. The black lines are roads, and you can see where there's higher density of roads. That's where our urban areas are. And most of the city of Ottawa is actually rural, as you might be able to see in the image. The Ottawa River is the blue to the north of Ottawa, and Quebec is to the north of us. Our organization is responsible for all infrastructure asset management of all water services, road, transit, parks, forestry, and natural systems. And it's the same organization that's responsible for public health, solid waste management, fire services, police, planning and developments, family and social services, amongst many other things. We generate our revenue from taxes, water, wastewater, stormwater rates, and fees to some minor extent. And unlike some utilities or other organizations, just to be clear, we are a municipality, so the top of our governance structure is not an engineer or a technical manager. It's the mayor and council, and they are responsible for all of those things above. Next slide, please. And so let's transition now to what you wanted to hear about, our PIEVC studies. Next slide, please. To start, I'll talk about our this project, the Graham Creek Stormwater Infrastructure. Graham Creek, we call it a stormwater infrastructure. It's the project dealt with a multi-segment culvert system in an urban creek. It's also an outlet for the storm sewer, so the storm sewers connect to the culvert itself. Based on condition alone, the system required renewal. It actually is buried quite deep as it crosses under railroad tracks, and it crosses over a very deep trunk sanitary sewer. The culvert and the creek itself are very close to adjacent properties and homes, and it's not a straight alignment, so it's not a very straightforward set of infrastructure system. The interesting thing here for me is we were doing this design because of condition. That was already well underway, but we thought there's an opportunity here to use the PIEVC analysis to understand what recommendations we might generate for dealing with climate change. So this was our first opportunity to test the PIEVC protocol on our infrastructure and really to build staff capacity. So we weren't mandated to do this, but we wanted to understand how this protocol worked, build staff capacity. And so what happened is we had a kind of a natural experiment, because we were doing this in parallel with the culvert renewal design, and we were going to see whether the recommendations coming out of the renewal design that weren't considering the PIEVC analysis, how that would compare with the recommendations coming out of the PIEVC analysis. Next slide, please. So just to cut to the answer, what we found, and I think this is consistent with what I've heard in other jurisdictions as well, PIEVC works very well, or it did for us, for critical, complex, and large infrastructure design and renewal. In particular, and this is something that not all of our subject matter experts were really thinking about at the beginning of the project, it was great at helping identify risks and solutions for non-ideal conditions. And what I mean by that is oftentimes we look at a culvert and we try to understand the hydraulics, the hydrology, how big should it be, what are the losses, things like that. But the PIEVC protocol really challenged us to think about things like debris that might be coming down the creek when we had large rainfall events, but also windstorm events that create branch debris. To be completely fair, we kind of knew about that anyways, but it was one of the reasons we needed to renew the culvert system. There's a large tree trunk stuck in the middle of the culvert, but the PIEVC protocol really helped us focus on not only normal culvert design, but these non-ideal conditions. And we found, maybe not surprisingly, but we found that actually most of our existing processes and practices were validated by the PIEVC analysis, meaning we didn't have to radically change the design once we layered on the PIEVC analysis. There were some things that PIEVC added to the process for sure, but they ended up being some of the non-infrastructure components, like how do we identify these different infrastructure systems? Is that a structure, a road asset, or a water asset? And that may seem to be not too critical for some people, but in the city of Ottawa, those different assets are managed by different people. So not knowing who owns this ends up having unintended consequences. But in any case, the PIEVC process was very helpful in demonstrating that we were doing our due diligence, even if it didn't radically change the design. Next slide, please. And what were the lessons learned from a risk management perspective? Well, we found that the PIEVC protocol was great at helping identify interdependencies between infrastructure components. Normally, when we start a renewal process, there may be a limited scope to what interdependencies we might look at. They might be the more obvious ones. And it helped us identify non-infrastructure vulnerabilities as well. We found that PIEVC was great at drawing together a team of subject matter experts. That's part of how the protocol is built. And they weren't necessarily climate experts. And it allows us to use those experts and the best available data to really make decisions. I think one of the benefits that I really appreciate is that there's always going to be uncertainty about something, but the PIEVC protocol allows us to use the best data, make the best decisions, and move past that uncertainty to really start to do the work of mitigation or renewal. And one thing I found interesting was, before we started the PIEVC protocol, I understood that there's a module where or a process, a side process where you do engineering analysis. And coming into the PIEVC protocol, my thought about what that engineering analysis would be normal culvert analysis and design. And I think the PIEVC protocol really kind of opened my eyes to the benefit that we had in this study for having studied the entire neighborhood ahead of time, done dual drainage numerical modeling to understand the surface and subsurface flood risks. And all of those really helped really confirm the direction we were taking with the culvert. We understood a bit of the bigger picture before coming into the culvert analysis. And that kind of pointed us towards, oh, okay, well, then it caused us to think about how we integrate these individual infrastructure component designs with larger analyses and studies. Next slide, please. And finally, asset management implications. And here's the thing that really stuck with me that caused us to go to the next step that I'll get to in a second. It took about 12 months to do the PIEVC analysis. We had multiple meetings with multiple subject matter experts. And here's the kicker. The Graham Creek stormwater infrastructure consisted of 2 culverts of thousands that we own that are large and medium size. I think the number is somewhere between 6,000 and 7,000. And I know Ottawa is not the largest city, but for us, that's a large number of assets. But those are just the large and medium sized ones that we have cataloged. We have many, many more small culverts. So it became immediately obvious that we couldn't necessarily, or we shouldn't use PIEVC in one particular way, the way we did for Graham Creek, for all of those other culverts, because presumably not all of them had the same risk or complexity as the Graham Creek stormwater infrastructure. But then beyond that, culverts are actually just one of many asset classes that we manage. Even if you just talk about water services, the services that I'm responsible for, it was just one of many water asset classes that we manage. So that made us ask the question, how do we best use PIEVC in asset management going forward? Next slide, please. And post Graham Creek study, we did another small study where we tried to pull apart some of these questions. We acknowledge that, this is one asset in isolation from other assets in the same class. And just looking at one asset at a time, we don't have this general knowledge of the state of all assets. In the case of Graham Creek, we did the study because the culvert was at its end of life cycle. But was that good enough for all the other culverts to wait until the end of life cycle? That was one of the questions we had. We also knew that the analysis was in isolation of the broader understanding of risks and needs of all the other assets in that class. So in the case of Graham Creek, we found that it had a lot of capacity for climate change. But if it didn't, how far would we go for one culvert? And would that be something that we could replicate for all other culverts? And these are questions that we were asked by council and residents. Why did you go so far in one case and not so far in another case? And some other questions that we were asking ourselves is, can we build on past risk assessments that we've already done? Can we use the PIEVC protocol to understand our risks for non-clean conditions or where there are interdependencies? And can we use those risks to prioritize our next actions? Next slide, please. And so one of the things we came up with in the post-PIEVC study was a risk screening approach for asset classes. And the risk screening, we thought we could standardize our climate data. What I mean by that is every time we've done any climate analysis previously, including Graham Creek, we kind of did it from first principles. We work with consultants, we look at the best climate data available, but we realized that took a period of time in this PIEVC analysis. And if we could understand the broad range of climate data, we may be able to do the next PIEVC analysis a little quicker. So even if the climate data isn't necessarily relevant to all culverts, maybe it's relevant to water mains, for example. Similarly, standardized climate interactions. So the PIEVC protocol asks us to look at infrastructure components and climate parameters and determine whether there's an interaction between the parameter and the component. Identify typical vulnerability parameters, use GIS in particular to identify and categorize vulnerabilities across the city. And Graham Creek showed us that there's some opportunity to do that. Standardize all the other components of PIEVC, impact descriptions, consequences, that sort of thing. and then finally use those vulnerability parameters to estimate severity and risk. And what would we do with that risk screening process? That, as you might be able to get a sense of, that's not necessarily the most precise for any individual culvert. But what we thought is we could use that to triage risk mitigation actions. So for high risk assets that were screened as high risk through this process, we could still proceed to a full PIEVC or a design or environmental assessment that includes PIEVC, and we wouldn't then be limited to the standardized climate data that we used. If there's something unique about that asset that we needed to look at, or an interaction that we needed to consider, or a vulnerability that we hadn't considered in the screening, that would be subject to the analysis we did there. So the screening wouldn't limit us there. But we imagine most of our assets would be in maybe a medium risk category. And so can we identify standard adaptation and mitigation measures for those risks, including life cycle renewal recommendations, midlife interventions, and non-infrastructure adaptations. And we assume that many of our assets might actually be in a low risk. And this is another benefit of PIEVC. I normally thought, well, you do it so you could identify what the high risks are. But in asset management, it's actually very useful to also identify what the low risks are. So you could show that you've done your due diligence, and you shouldn't be spending more time on low risk things than is warranted. Next slide, please. We'll skip this. This is just a visual conceptualization of what I just said. Next slide, please. And so, great. I was energized. I was ready to start using this new screening process or further developing it. And then what got in the way of me doing climate change adaptation work? Well, it was climate change adaptation work, because in the meantime, council declared a climate emergency. We were citywide doing a climate change master plan. We were doing new asset management plans that needed to consider climate change, updating our infrastructure master plan that needed to consider climate change, and updating design guidelines that needed to deal with climate change. So all of these new pressures or emerging pressures kind of put my risk screening protocol in the background. Next slide, please. But actually, it was useful to have thought through that risk screening process, because what we decided at that time is we should do one citywide climate risk vulnerability assessment. In our case, for all water services, there was a larger group doing it for all the other city assets and functions and services. But we could actually get some of what we wanted out of the risk screening process out of that process. We could have, for example, standardized climate parameters and interactions and vulnerability descriptions, and so on. But the question we asked ourselves, and the question I'm still being asked today, is what's the use of doing this at such a high level citywide? Is it going to tell our operations staff to do anything different? What are we getting out of all this activity? And it may be for some a little disappointing, but I think many of the benefits come from an asset management or just an infrastructure management perspective. First of all, we've never actually documented these risks. Our subject matter experts are saying, hey, look, we know that these are risks. And my answer is, yeah, but we've never really formally documented it. And if we don't formally document it, it's hard for us to identify gaps. It's hard for us to communicate and report to council and the public. It's hard for engineers who aren't born today, but who will be taking my job eventually, to understand what we know and to onboard them and to transfer that knowledge. And it's difficult to maintain alignment between all our different activities, but also alignment in a different sense. Well, are we prioritizing the right risks and the right infrastructure components? Are we budgeting enough for those activities, and do we have enough staff allocated for that? So as I mentioned, we did region-wide climate change projections. We actually collaborated with many of the other stakeholders in our regions. As I mentioned, we have multiple municipalities in the National Capital Region, but we also have the federal government and other organizations in Ottawa. So we decided that it was worthwhile for us all to be singing from the same songbook and using a common set of climate projections. what was interesting is there was a challenge that we discovered for data management. So just for stormwater services, which is only 1/3 of all water services, as an example, we tried to keep things as simple as possible with our categorization of the infrastructure components, but we had essentially come up with a table that had 900 rows, I think around 30 columns, more than 35,000 cells. And so that's a lot of data to make sure we got right. It's a lot of data to manage. And we decided that we needed to use some higher functions in Excel, like Power Pivot, to manage that. And it also forced us to reinterpret what risk meant, because the question came up in our internal discussions. Well, what does this mean when we say it's a low risk? Does that, and for me, it means it helps with prioritization perhaps, but it doesn't mean that low risks are things we ignore when we think citywide. A low risk might be clearing snow off the top of a catch basin grate, but we're not saying that's an unimportant thing. We're just saying under the current program, with the current infrastructure and the current techniques, the risk is low. But if we stopped clearing snow off catch basins, perhaps the risk would increase. So we really had to be clear on what we meant by risk when we were communicating upwards. Next slide, please. And so some final thoughts. I hope I didn't go too far over time. The next slide. What we found in this process, it was useful to look at PIEVC or risk at many different scales, because you see different things at different scales. And I might have thought, well, there's a right way to do it. You do it from the top down or the bottom up. But we found that it was valuable to even skip around a little bit, because each level kind of informs the other levels as well. Next slide. And so just really quickly, my final thoughts, PIEVC Protocol, I found extremely valuable tool for Canadian engineers. It's easy to follow, provides clarity on how to address climate change and infrastructure design, helps us navigate issues of imperfect infrastructure data, helps us deal with uncertainty of future climate change or climate conditions. And in particular with asset management, I found it useful to adapt this and other tools for different purposes. It's not that the PIEVC protocol isn't useful at other levels, but we may just have to rethink what the output means, or perhaps do it in different ways. So I'll end there, because I know we have other presentations coming up. Thank you.
Thank you, Huron. And we're going to pass it quickly over to Na and Nam. We are a little bit over time. We'll try to save some time for questions at the end, but if we don't get to everybody's questions, we'll find a way to make sure the audience can connect with the presenters and follow up with questions. And with that, I'll pass it over to Na.
Okay, thank you for your introduction, Dan. Good evening, everybody from Ho Chi Minh City. On behalf of the studies team today, I'm glad to share our work regarding apply the PIEVC for Cái Lớn Cái Bé sluice gate in the Mekong Delta using the PIEVC protocol. Next slide, please. My talk has four parts. The first thing I give you a short introduction about the infrastructure that we selected for apply the PIEVC. The second one, I will share you how we apply PIEVC in Vietnam. And the first thing is the main finding and how our work contribute into the project. And the last one is another example to apply the PIEVC scanner in another case in the Mekong Delta. Next slide, please. All right, as you may know, the Vietnamese Mekong Delta is located in the downstream part of the Mekong River Basin, and the Vietnamese Mekong Delta approach directly to the West Sea and East Sea of Vietnam, as you can see on the map on the right-hand side. This delta is ranked as the most vulnerable delta to the climate change and anthropogenic impacts, as mentioned in numerous study in the study nowadays. And the Vietnamese government recognize about the current and the future challenges regarding about climate change and man-made development, so that so that the government very concerned in terms of develop the strategy for the climate change adaptation to the Mekong Delta. That reason why we invest some of the infrastructure. Here is the Kalung KBS Luggage system. As you can see in the black box, rectangular box is indicates the located of the Kalung KBS. The system include two big sluice gates, include Kalung sluice gate and KBS sluice gate. The Kalung sluice gate have 11 gates and 2 ship lock, while the KBS have the 2 gates and 1 ship lock. They are the multiple purpose of the construction with the 3 main objectives. The first thing to control the soil intrusion from the West Sea to the inland, and resolve the conflict between the water use between agriculture and aquaculture in this area. And another object is to respond to climate change and the impact from the seagrass to protect the hinterland and to retain the freshwater resources for the dry season. We have studied this project from 2006 until 2017. We started for design planning, and the design planning taken place from 2017 to 2019. After that, we start to construct construction from 2019 to 2020. And now, for now, is under operating phase. And fortunately, during the design phase, we got the support from the GIZ to apply the PIEVC protocol to assess the climate risk on this project during the design phase. Now I will show you how we carry out the PIEVC application in the Kalung KBS project. Next slide, please. To be honest, at the first time when we heard about the PIEVC, it was new to us at that time. We don't know how to use this. Luckily, we got support from the Canadian expert, and the core study team was from gather various experts from engineer from our institute, calamitorists from the Southern Regional Hydrometeorology Center, and the project owner from PU10 under Mars. And we also have economies expert. Along with that, we also have some advisor and information supplier from MPI and Mars, and the other expert to support us during implement PIEVC application. As I mentioned that due to the PIEVC was new to us at that time, so we adopt coaching approach. That means we got the training from the Canadian expert, and then we apply what we learned directly from them. Along with that, we also have the back and forth the meeting online, offline with the international expert to get their comment and advice during we apply this protocol in Vietnam. The graph in the center of the slide shows you the follow work that we apply. It includes 10 steps. I don't want to go to further detail about that, but I would emphasize that during the implement the PIEVC, we carry out the field trip at the project site. As you can see that the pupil, as you can see that some the picture on the right hand side, and the other training was held up during the implementation of the PIEVC. And the last picture illustrates the challenge we together developed the matrix risk. Here some the result from our work. For example, here we determine which the critical climate critical and hydrology critical for the each component of the slugate. The slugate was separated into the main component, for example, shiplock, gas, and the other component. And corresponding with each the component, we determine the thresholds, determine the probability score, and then we got the risk score for each component. Based on that, we determine the historical risk score and future risk score. That inform the potential risk for the each component of the project in the slugate in the future. Next slide, please. Here, this is the risk assessment matrix for historical condition. I don't want to go to detail, but I should pick the significant point here. I will share as you can see that on the slide, the rest cycle illustrates the result of the risk score for the shiplock. Caused by the hydrology and salinity. In the historical condition, the risk score is 8. However, it's increased in the future. In the next slide, please. In the future, the score risk of the shiplock regarding hydrological driver increase 20. That means in the future, the shiplock could be risk regarding the hydrology driver in the future, and it's informed us need to make some the solution current now for to ensure the resilience of this component in the future. Next slide, please. I would like to summarize some of the finding and the contribution of our work for the design for the project. For the finding is summarized corresponding with each component. For example, the concrete component, mental component, and operational staff. Each component we determine the specific the climate factor. For example, for a concrete component of the pillars or the shiplock, we determine the high temperature, heat and heat wave. Water level and salinity is a critical factor put the concrete component at risk in the future. As a result, we recommend that should increase the high quality of the concrete grade for this component, and the coating methods by HPOC should be applied. Another example regarding the electric system, we rely based on the result. We rely that the thunderstorm, lightning, tornado, and heavy rainfall put this system at risk in the future. So underground this system, in to ensure the operation and maintenance of the slugate operation in the future. Next slide, please. Here is the typical contribution of our work. I think that this slide could help you easier to recognize how our work contribute to the design. The two upper image illustrates the initial design on the left and the right hand side and the final design. In the initial design, the shiplock placed at the middle of the river. However, in the final design, the design that we use to construct the system, now the shiplock moved to nearby the river bank. That's one of that we partially contribute to change this design aspect for the system. Another aspect we contribute to improve the design is the underground electric system for the slugate system, and we also propose apply the FOC coating for the slugate because in the future the results indicate that the soil concentration in the water will be increased, coupled with the increasing of the water temperature. So that's increasing the coating protection, very important for the slugate in the future. another aspect we contribute in terms of concrete. The concrete we suggest for the project manager, project owner should increase the quality of the concrete in the context of the high concentration, high salinity concentration associated with the increase of the water temperature in the future, as the research pointed out. Next slide, please. Another example, we have a trend to apply the PIEVC scanner or screening application for in the Vietnam. In this project, we carry out the PIEVC application for 83 sluice gates along the coast, as you can see on the map. Look at that on the higher corner. To carry out this test, we divide the study area into 3 regions with more or less similar the climate characteristic, and we group the sluice gate in each the sub region into the same the matrix assessment, and then we got the result as you can see on the screen. Particularly the higher the risk in the future for some components such as sluice gate or the gas project increase in the future. This the result informed to the authority need to carry some the solution to maintain their sluice gates in order to make sure it work well in the coming year under climate change in the Mekong Delta. Next slide, please. For a conclusion, I have 5 observations and remarks. The first thing, we realize that PIEVC can contribute or enhance the resilience of the proposed design, particularly in the project of Kai Lớn Kai Bé sluice gate. And it also contribute to increase resilience for the existing infrastructure, and it could help increase the lifespan of the infrastructure. The second thing is the PIEVC have potential to be applied, replicated, and extended applied in Vietnam in the Mekong Delta. For sure, it should be update or localized to adapt with the local characteristic. For example, in the original PIEVC, when we we realize that it doesn't have soil intrusion or the water level, something like that. But when we apply it in Vietnam, we add some the local parameter in the Mekong Delta in the PIEVC. Future PIEVC application will be cheaper and faster and easier. We think that because we have the copyright and we can review the data what we purchased in for one of the infrastructure in the same region. The fourth conclusion is the roles of climatic assessment for infrastructure investment and the was proved and highlighted, and the need for adaptation measurement. The last one is proved and highlighted the roles of climate service for climatic assessment. Next slide, please. This is my presentation, and this is the picture of the Kai Lớn sluice gate. As you can see that now it's constructed and its operation to regulate the water resources to control the soil intrusion in the Mekong Delta. Thank you for your extension.
Thank you, Nam. Next we have Na. Na, if you wouldn't mind, we are a little bit over time. We'd like to see maybe 10 minutes or so for a discussion at the end. Thank you.
Okay, I try to be quick. Thank you, Dan. Good morning, everyone. Good evening from Vietnam. My name is Võ Bang Nga. I'm from Ministry of Planning and Investment. Our ministry is in charge of planning, allocating, mobilizing state budgets, ODA, FDI, and other financial resources. And my department is Science, Education, Natural Resources, and Environment. And my department has been a political partner for the Climate Service for Infrastructure Investment CSI project implemented by GIZ on behalf of German government as part of its national climate initiative. And as you already hear from Mr. Nam, we have achieved some substantial results from the project. In Kai Bay has on the risk analysis assessments using the PIEVC protocol. And the results, we are really very proud of it, and we are looking forward to have it replicated and into many other cases like this. And actually, the project have gone a step further into a cost-benefit analysis and actually obtained preliminary results, which also includes a social aspect. For 3 different adjustments, as you can see on the slide. Next slide, please. As you can see on the slides, is the cost benefit analysis for upgrading concrete for pillars and ship blocks. Next one, please. And also for coating, changing the coating of the sluice gates. And next one, please. And the underground electric systems. So I just want to show you the number on these 3 slides, because the result of the project CBA is actually an example that that can act to be a quantitative measures that could be extremely useful for investor, for political decision makers in the process of integration of climate change adaptation measure into sector policies, institutionalizing of climate risk assessment and cost-benefit analysis of climate-proving measures. And this can also be obligatory step in project approving, specifically for the project that related to the climate vulnerable infrastructures or infrastructure in the vulnerable areas. We can also looking at the possibilities of standardized as technical norms or costs for constructions, for technical and operation design of the infrastructures. And also we can look at the climate risk to be included in the risk management process by the banks or the insurance companies, the risk transfer agency, or in the process of approving funding or loans for bankable infrastructure investment projects. Sorry, next slide, please. As for Vietnam, next one, please. We are now becoming more and more concerned about the resilience of those critical climate vulnerable infrastructures. And we have more enhanced awareness and focus on the capacity of the institutions related to the resilience of infrastructure against the climate change, as well as we have reflected those awareness into our policies. And recently, at the highest level, we have the law of environmental protection. And in the law has mentioned about the requirement assessment of the climate impacts in environment strategic assessment process. And we also have the our national climate change adaptation plan for the period of 2021-2030 with a vision to 2050. And in this one, it has mentioned that about the enhancing the climate resilience of infrastructure, and also our green growth strategy has also included the orientation in sustainable infrastructure. And climate resilience is also included in our national scheme for systematic infrastructure development in Vietnam in 2021-2030. So I just want to give you a few points of the context of Vietnam in the last few years, and I just want to emphasize that for the first time ever, a comprehensive visualization and assessment of climate risk of Thailand, Taipei, together with the preliminary results of the cost-benefit analysis, has become a demonstration, a display of a positive outcome, and this can play a very important role to motivate us towards achieving an inclusive capacity development strategy on climate risk management for the investment planning process. And we are continue to input the climate risk assessment and to further institutionalize the risk assessment in our planning process, including technical guidelines to support the investor, the planners, and those adaptation measures will become the qualifications to apply for available climate funds in order to achieve the climate change resilience infrastructures. Thank you. That's all from me for now. Sorry about the slides.
No problem. Thank you. Thank you very much. Very, very interesting presentation. So we do have a few minutes for questions. We've got quite a few questions from participants. So if our panelists wouldn't mind switching on their cameras, I think what we'll do is go through a few of the themes of the questions that came in during the presentations. So one theme that came up is actually sort of a common theme that we hear about in the PIEVC program is you as sort of technical experts in engineering dealing with expertise from climate change, and what was the role of sort of bringing in different expertise into this decision, into the vulnerability assessment process, and maybe how could that be facilitated a little bit better, or how did the PIEVC process specifically or other processes help with managing new uncertain data in these processes? And so maybe we'll go just around the table here, starting with Haran, since you're in the top left here.
Sure. So if I understand the question, Dan, so the first part is about dealing with outside climate experts who may or may not be engineering experts as well. So I think it's important. It's valuable. I think you have to start there because especially for traditional kind of Canadian engineers, I think we have to get outside our own comfort zone a little bit to think about risks that we haven't historically thought about. We've made certain assumptions which have been pretty good in the past about weather, climate data, intensity, duration, frequency curves. So I think it's going to be a challenge whenever you have slightly different professional competencies coming together and to figure out whether you're speaking the same language. But I think that's the important work of PIEVC is to try and then take that back and think about it from your own professional perspective, whether that's water resources or hydraulics or asset management. So I think the challenge is always going to be there, but that's the right challenge to be working on. I don't think we should expect that it's going to be just a cookbook type of solution. And then the second part, sorry, what was the second part of the question?
Well, I think it relates more to whether the necessary expertise is available and were you able to sort of incorporate that into your team?
Yeah, I think that's going to be an answer that's very specific to different organizations. We did have a lot of expertise in-house, but even with all of our great subject matter experts, I just think it's always great to never just rely on that for certain things, especially for complex, high risk, high criticality assets that we often, in fact, almost always lean on outside experts, whether those are engineers or climate experts or others.
Great, thanks, Haran. And Nam and Na, any comments about dealing with experts that may be from outside your normal area of work?
Well, let me share my experience why 2 times apply the PIEVC in Vietnam. To be honest, the terminology of the PIEVC for me when I first time to apply it a bit difficult. So that for me, it's the technical guys want to digest this. I need time and to involve directly apply it in the real case to get understand. That is example when we bring the result of the PIEVC to the manager, to the decision maker. That I think that one more challenges. So that means I think beside the user manual, beside the document for the technical apply this, use this in the real case. Somehow we need to I don't know, the version very simplified, easier to explanation, to have the order easy to digest, easy to understand about that, because the result we apply PIEVC not for us, for the client, for the decision maker. They use this, they make decision. So that's very important to do that. This is my my experience. Another thing in terms of uncertainty, due to we apply the rank, we score a trick. That means it could be somehow it's subjective, because it depends on my opinion and depends on the other opinion. So that how to harmonize, how to avoid the uncertainty caused from the subjective. That's very important to consider to apply this. That's all from my side. Thank you.
Thank you. Na, any thoughts?
Well, I'm coming from a technical background, but I'm still very lost in PIEVC, to be honest. But I have joined a lot of talk and webinars about PIEVC, and I realized that there is a certain gap between the technical practitioner and with the politician or the policymaker or the investor. So I think it's important that we can somehow bridge the gap between those. And also in Vietnam, we have a lot of challenge to integrate the adaptation policies across all the sectors. And I think we need to break the silo thinking and foster the collaboration amongst sectors and encourage people of various specified tasks to be open-minded and willing to cooperate with each other in the process.
Great, thank you very much. Marvin?
Yeah, for us, then I think the and maybe it's for all smaller and medium-sized municipalities, it's probably unlikely they'll have in-house expertise. I mean, we certainly didn't. You're more focused on your day-to-day municipal infrastructure maintenance. So for us, it was important to reach out to get some expertise, which what we did. We had a consultant help kind of navigate us through the whole process. But what was really interesting was, although it maybe initially on paper it seems a little bit complicated, it's really quite intuitive. It's essentially looking at your components and the whole process in terms of what, you know, which component is or could be affected by certain things. And it was really interesting, you know, like I said, we didn't have a lot of in-house expertise, but even just having a lot of the operators, the boots on the ground individuals around the table, I found was very valuable. They maybe didn't relay the information maybe in a PIEVC format, but it was essentially, hey, these are the things that we've dealt with. I've been here for 30 years and we've had big windstorms and we couldn't get to the generator to fill up the fuel, or just things that you don't think of necessarily day to day, but these folks were very beneficial. So when you put that all together into you know, like a risk matrix and then stand back and look at it, it actually does make a lot of sense. So I think having some expertise to help kind of navigate is important, but I think reaching internally to the folks that do the work day to day, at least for us, was very beneficial. So hopefully that's helpful.
Great, for sure. Thank you, Marvin. One very quick question. We have maybe 1 minute left, and I think maybe for Ron, but anybody else who would like to comment on it. You mentioned some of the non-infrastructure vulnerabilities that were identified in your work. Could you explain that quickly? And
yeah. So one non-infrastructure vulnerability. So what we would consider an infrastructure vulnerability might be something in particular in the Graham Creek about the culvert itself, whether it was straight or large enough or had a debris, trash racks, that sort of thing. Some of the non-infrastructure things were, okay, we have all that figured out, but we don't have physical access to get people down to inspect it on an annual basis. That's a non-infrastructure vulnerability. Not knowing what's happening with it is a vulnerability. Not being able to get equipment down is a vulnerability. And I mentioned another one, and we've been working on this, but defining what the asset is important in our organization to define who's responsible for inspecting it, and not knowing or other people, everyone thinking someone else is responsible for inspecting it is a vulnerability, because ultimately what that means is it won't get inspected.
Great. Thank you, Ron. Unfortunately, I think we'll have to end it there. We're up against the clock. I didn't want to cut off the great presentations. I know that the community really wants to hear about cases, and all of you provide excellent examples. Now, we didn't get a chance to talk about the amazing return on investment of the work. Clearly, that's an important message to get out, and it has important policy implications. So thank you for that. And thank you again to all our presenters. There are more questions, and hopefully we can find a way, with your permission, to share contact information with our participants. They can follow up with questions. A quick note on the next webinar, which will be on October 20th, that will concern institutionalizing climate change and infrastructure vulnerability and risk assessment, considering specifically PIEVC in application plans, professional practice, and other mechanisms. That will be at noon on October 20th. As usual, that will be recorded. If you're not able to attend, you can view that at a later time. I'd also like to direct your attention to Claire's comments about the survey. If you have a moment to fill out the survey about this webinar, we very much like your feedback, and it'll help us direct thinking on future webinars. So once again, thank you again. Thank you to CRI for hosting the event. Thank you for the excellent presentations, and we hope to continue this conversation in the future.